So hi, everybody. Thank you. I wanted to talk today about what actually makes Europe special. So is there any DNA in European startups? And before talking about the specific DNA, I just wanted to give a little bit more insight of what we see at Daphni as being the European landscape today. And I'm going to tell some obvious things here, but one that's we have a well-educated and cheaper talents than what we have in the US, but it's also more loyal, and there's multicultural that is native within Europe, so that makes us quite strong in the type of teams that we can build. Other thing being that obviously we have strong tech hubs that have emerged in Europe, and if you look at the way we looked at it was to say, well, if you look at the way Silicon Valley was built, it's a lot around having this, the influence of one particular company that was PayPal at the beginning, that where all the different founders afterwards just went to found their own companies and spread the whole thing. So if you look at LinkedIn, for example, there's one of the existing PayPal founders. There's Reid Hoffman. There's Peter Thiel, that was the existing investor in Facebook. The YouTube founder was actually at PayPal. Elon Musk is an ex-PayPal. So there's this mafia, PayPal mafia, that really built the whole thing. And if you look basically at what in the Paris ecosystem, for example, the Credeo, which was the first international success, really brought a lot of connection, a lot of ambition on top of that, and new business angels, new founders for ambitious companies, etc. So if you look at the different cities in Europe which have born more than 2 unicorns, there's actually 7. There's London, Berlin, Paris, Stockholm, Helsinki, Copenhagen, and Amsterdam. And you can see that that means there's a certain maturity of the ecosystem, a certain level of ambition, and the right density in terms of talents, in terms of investors. And so that means there's a lot of things to move up in the future. But also what is new, and that was not 10 years ago, is that these different cities start being connected between each other. Usually when you were starting a European company, you were always going to the US and really trying to build bridge with the US. But now what we see is that cities and European hubs are trying to build links together to try to build a more pan-European scene, a more coherent one. The last one is the venture capital, and it's not only about European venture capital, it's also about US venture capitalists coming to Europe. So we see a lot more like USV, Union Square from New York, or other Californian investors coming there. So that means we have a lot of ground assets to make it thrive in the future as well. One thing that we do have in Europe that is actually super specific, that I think is an opportunity for us, is that in the digital world, we're working with obsolete rules. Like there's nothing around data, everything around taxation is complete for the old world. We have new problems like ethics or things like that that nobody is really tackling, and that means new international governance and rules. And when doing that, there's no place outside Europe where you can really build a thought leadership there, because you need to convince a certain number of people. So it's not because the Chinese government is going to say something or the US government. When Europe comes up and has 27 countries saying, we believe this should be the right governance for data privacy or for AI or whatever, it really means something that nobody else can say. So I think we really have a role to play in the way we want to structure the world going forward, and that there's a unique chance for Europe to really be on top of this thought leadership in the future. And knowingly, there's 2 specific topics that we should be really focusing on. One is ethics, because if you look at Isaac Asimov, you remember the laws of robotics in the 1970s? Well, they were saying you should never allow a robot to kill, but today we have drones that actually kill people, and nobody's really thought about, is this something that we want? Is this something that we want to allow robots to do? And so this whole reflection around putting the right type of ethics in the way we build innovation in the future is actually super important. Same thing for environment and social constraints, where we're living a revolution around work. We also have this whole climate change that is impacting everybody, so how can we put that in the DNA of what we're building is something important as well. So something that actually is really different when you build a European startup than when you build a US startup is that there's, even if wherever you're coming from, let it be London, let it be Berlin, let it be Paris or whatever, there's your local market is not enough for you to reach critical mass, point. I mean, period. There's no other way around. And that's very different from the US, where you can actually build critical mass just on your local market. So that means you need to think international from scratch, and that means it's actually different than the way you build your company from what we have seen in the US. And this globalization actually means, of course, you need to be more competitive at the international level, because if you're not going, people are coming. So Uber coming to Berlin, even though it's, Berlin taxis didn't go there, et cetera. So you need to have that level of competitiveness in your product, in your service. And that means when you think about building it, the question is, do you have some specific DNA, some specific advantages of being born in Europe that you wouldn't have if you had been born elsewhere, and that will give you more the potential of optimizing your success abroad, right? Is there some strengths that you could be really focusing on, and that gives you better chance of succeeding at the international level? And when we looked at that, we said, well, there's something really specific about the the digital economy, is that it's usage-driven. That means you're reaching out to people in professional or private life, right? And so when thinking about is there any natural advantages, what we should really be focusing on is what is the DNA of European societies. And if you look at that, and if you look at the different very big successes in Europe, and you try to map them around different pillars, you find three. The first one is that in Europe, we think on a collective base. When you look at the quality of the infrastructure, let it be telecom, transportation, energy, it's nowhere else to be seen. When you look at how we think about education, about healthcare, about insurance, we think very inclusively for everybody. We want to cover the whole society. Or sharing economy is mostly used in Europe than anywhere else. Like Airbnb, 60% of the usage is done in Europe. Second pillar is the quality of life. When you're looking at building a greater balance between your professional and your private life, and that actually makes industry like tourism, like culture, like food thrive. Or we have also, this is also why we have this greater sense around privacy and all these different topics. And the last pillar would be what we have called inventiveness, which is obviously we're very strong in creative industries like luxury or fashion, but we have this strong tradition of engineering, of inventing things. And the question is, if you look at that way, and you try to do the same exercise with the US, do you find the same thing? Is there really something specific? And when you do that exercise, you find that in the US, it's actually very different pillars. The first one is productivity. You're really trying to optimize the way people collaborate, people work together, optimizing the performance of each different role within a company, trying to use data to make better business decisions. So really a great focus on productivity. Second pillar is the empowerment, which is kind of the counterpart of the European collectiveness, which is a lot more about pioneers, self-made man, and this is, they put themselves on top on social media to really express themselves or build their own path around defense, intelligence and security, etc. Or all this about optimizing your time and your consumption or going out for space. Well, really this idea of making your own life a self-made man. And the last pillar is entertainment, with Hollywood as an alma mater of a whole ecosystem of virtual reality, of animation, of big medias. So if you kind of compare the two, you see that actually the idea we have around digital economy and the way it models our society is actually very US-based. But if you want to be very successful and build new champions, we should embrace our values and our societal values of having this DNA and really making the best out of it. Then something that we actually have to deal with as being venture capitalists or entrepreneurs is that something that's still truly missing in the European landscape is that we do not have yet the type of strategic acquirers that the US have. So it's still very much US-driven. And to give you numbers, if you looked at like Google's or Alphabet's last 18 months in terms of number of acquisition, they did something around 70. And in France, like the 250 biggest company acquired 40. It's really not in the culture of our companies to try to innovate by buying startups, whereas it's really in the, still in the DNA of strategic, to have strategic acquisition when you're building a big company in the US. That's also is linked to the age of our corporates in Europe. Like, same thing to give you numbers. In France, we have what we call the CAC 40, which is the 40 biggest company. The average age of this company is 105 years old. So it's then, and you look at the Google and of this world, they're 20, 30 years old max. And you see that we're really not in an economy, and that's actually worth for France, but worth for Germany as well, or worth for the UK. We're not in an economy that actually has a path to growth that is smooth, and that is we haven't been building champions for a while. So having this in mind, you could see also that one of the reasons they are not acquiring startups is, well, they didn't do it a lot, so they don't have that much experience. And the little experience they have, they actually failed a lot to retain talents, to retain founders. Right? And that's a savoir-faire that the very big US companies do have. Like if you look at the retention rate of the founders at Alphabet, it's around 2/3. Like 2/3 of the founders from which their startups were acquired by Google or by Alphabet are still there. And in Facebook, it's 75%. Like Facebook is the best buyer. So it's really something that is still lacking in Europe, but I do have hope because they, in Europe, have understood something that is very important, is that the digital transformation is here, and that is basically here to disrupt their own industries. And there's still a lot of competition in Europe. And in the US, the trend we have seen, and there's been a very interesting economical study recently done by Thomas Philippon, which is that if you look at the US incumbents, they actually have gone to a lower concentration. They're going to monopolies because there's been a very little consensus from a political perspective to maintain antitrust at the level it was. And they've been lobbying so much that they actually have built a lot of monopolies in the US in all the different industries. So in general, what you can observe is that all these companies are investing less than what we see for European companies. There's lower competition for incumbents in the US than what you see in Europe. And that means they're more agile, and that means they're investing more and they're innovating more. So I believe we're going to see change in the future, and we also already saw changes in big companies starting to acquire startups with checks of 200 million euros or more, of hundreds of million euros. And so with this trend of the United States not applying their antitrust model as much as they did before, and the European really applying it, of having greater innovation and greater competition, even if in older companies, and maybe that could solve a little bit the exit market problem that we do still have in Europe. So that was it, I guess. Yes, thank you. Have questions? Is there anything you want me to elaborate on? I didn't see the time, so I kind of speeded the whole thing. No? Do you want to talk about the difference between Paris, London, Berlin, and all this? No? Yeah, that's good? Okay. So what as I was telling you before, there's something that was quite interesting, is to see the maturity of the different tech hubs. And there's actually not that much of billion-dollar companies that were built from the south city of Europe, like Italy or Spain or Portugal. You see dynamism, but there's no role model yet of a company that was really the international leader that went public, for example, on a stock exchange, and that was really taking it off. There's been Yux in Italy, but that's basically a little limited. And then if you look at the differences between London, Berlin, and Paris, and Stockholm, that maybe I know most, in London there's a lot around and it's been changing with Brexit. So let's just start from where it was. A lot around fashion tech and fintech, obviously, and of course, there's also benefiting from the fact that before you had like Estonian companies settling their headquarters in London to whenever they were growing to get access to the United States more easily, etc. So in terms of number of companies that are London-based that were really successful at the international level, it helped a lot the ecosystem. And there has this big asset of being very multicultural. Berlin is the same, very multicultural. And Paris is lacking, this is one of the weaknesses of the Paris ecosystem, is that if you look at the tech talents, they are still, it's 22% of tech talents that are foreigners in Paris, whereas it's 49% in London and 53% in Berlin, or vice versa, where around 50% tech talents that are foreigners in Berlin and London. And that's actually a super great asset. And the other thing that makes the international part a little weakness for Paris is that if you look at the local VCs, there are more money in Paris than what you have in Berlin. Of course, London is way above, but it's local money. And so if you look at the number of rounds that are done only by local VCs, it's around 75% in France, and it's only, I would say, 55% in Germany or something like that. So that means at the board level, there's international boards on a more frequent basis in Germany than what you have in France. And so the way, this is why you might have heard that there's been an announcement from the French President Emmanuel Macron around the French tech ticket, which is actually to make it easy for foreigners to come and work to Paris, because they acknowledge that in terms of the tech expertise, the quality of the engineers, they're still super good in France and attractive, but they're lacking this international spirit, both in terms of investment and money, and in terms of talents. And so this is one of the movements that you will see from the Parisian ecosystem in the coming years, and that has already been working on, especially since there's this change in paradigm with the Brexit of foreign talents coming out of London, or corporates moving their headquarters out of London. I'm sure you have seen that Deutsche Bank is moving back to Frankfurt, but we suspect there's going to be more of that. And so question in there is in type of expertise and how the different ecosystems will work together. So London, very big fashion tech, fintech. Berlin, we see more coming out of obviously, it was very good on transaction-based e-commerce, more low-tech things. But the good news is that there's a lot around blockchain coming up in Berlin, and a lot also around now industry, people coming from more industry verticals and moving on to build their startups. And that's kind of part of a natural trend, which is we see a second generation of startups that is not only tackling sectors where it was easy to disintermediate and re-intermediate, but now that we're really going into segments and sectors that are joining and need mixed expertise, more science around healthcare being disrupted, or industry with knowledge with automotive or whatever. So we see the second generation of startups that need mixed expertise. And that in Germany, we see a lot of obviously expertise around the different industries. So it's very good that these people coming from the industry try to mix with people coming from the tech industry to build new type of startups and build a greater barrier to entries. And in Paris, what we see is more scientific people. Like there's a lot of teams that are joining forces between a doctor and a tech person, a machine learning expert or data scientist or whatever, trying to disrupt like the health industry. And we see a lot in environment and agriculture, etc. So this trend is here to stay, I believe, and this is why we see all the more difficult industries to be disrupted to move forward. Thank you. This time I think I'm good.